Welcome, and thanks very much for joining today's webinar on grant writing basics. My name is Diane Meyerfeld, and I'm the Sustainable Agriculture Coordinator for UW-Madison Extension. I'm also the Wisconsin contact for the U.S. Department of Agriculture Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, SARE for short. SARE has several grant programs for research and education in sustainable agriculture, including one specifically for farmers that we'll cover briefly tomorrow. So today's presentation is the first of two webinars about grant opportunities for farmers. Tomorrow's presentation, also at noon, will feature representatives from several grant programs and a farmer to provide overviews and answer questions about a range of the grant programs that are available here in Wisconsin. Our presenter today is Margaret Krome, who is Policy Director at the Michael Fields Agricultural Institute. Margaret has a wealth of experience working with grant programs for agriculture, and she's going to share some of her top tips with us today. She's basically taken a 2-day workshop and distilled it down into 55 minutes. Margaret, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, Diane. Thank you very much. And I think I have just screen shared. Tell me if you all can see what I'm thinking you can see.
Margaret, it looks good.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to try to minimize myself. I don't really need to see myself. So hi, everybody. I hope that you understand that the reason we picked noon is so that people can chomp and think and chat and engage. So please jump into lunch and enjoy yourselves. I'm going to give you a moment of explanation about how I started doing these workshops. I've done them since the mid-90s. And the reason was I started because I had at that point spent a half dozen years coordinating nationally the appropriations grassroots campaign every year for the sustainable ag movement around the country. And I kept thinking, my goodness, we work so hard to get funding for these programs, but I don't really have the feeling that a lot of people even know that they exist. And so I spoke with some of our funders and said, what do you think about putting together a guide to federal programs that could be supportive of sustainable agriculture? And they said, oh, yes, let's do. And they 100% supported it. And then I asked folks in the community, and I said, it seems like we don't want these guides just to sit on the shelves. What about doing workshops? And I will say my funder said yes to that too. And so I asked colleagues, what should be in a workshop that would help people most? And the first piece of advice I got was different from what I thought it would be. It was, don't start with how do you write grants or even where do you find grants, but start with how do you design a good program that then is ready to seek grant funding or other program support. And so that's the first module. And then the second piece is where do you go to how and where do you go to find funding and optimize your chances of picking a program that's really well suited for you. So that's what I will be speaking about today. And then tomorrow, as Diane said, you'll have a really great lineup to talk about specific tips of grant writing and how you go about it. So I'm going to get started here. Oh, you know what, Diane, I'm wondering. Yes, okay, good. It did go forward. So I work for the Michael Fields Agricultural Institute. We are located in East Troy, Wisconsin, which is Southeast Wisconsin. I live and work in Madison. And so today, just to reiterate, we're going to first start talking about how do you design sound projects and then identifying possible funding sources. A second note to you is that one of the attachments that the links that Diane sent around at one point is to a set of materials that we usually use in these workshops, and they're intended to be useful for you in taking notes. So feel free to download those and take notes in the margins as we're speaking, if that makes sense to you. The other thing to say is we will aim to bring this section to a close. I will aim in maybe 20 minutes or a little more at the most. and then let you ask some questions. Then I'll do a pause, a few questions, and then go to the other section. I always aim to make sure you understand that you actually know most of what you need to know now. You may not have organized it in your mind yet in the way that will be most useful to you in thinking through how to design a grant program, but mostly it's pretty straightforward. And so what I hope you come away saying was, yeah, I knew all that. If you say that, I won't be disappointed, because I really want you to realize that you do know what you need to know already. So when you start to think about designing sound projects, usually when we do this workshop, I ask you for information, and I kind of concluded that for this format, it's probably not as practical to do that. So I am just gonna, I'm afraid, give you the feedback that I've gotten from doing these workshops all around the country for the last 20 something years. But one of the first things you want to do is ask the question, what is it that I'm trying to accomplish? What are the goals? What is the problem? Or if it's a business opportunity, what is the opportunity that I'm trying to address? And so I'm going to say, what do I mean by goals and what do I mean by measurable objectives? What are the goals? Well, I just gave you an example of a goal. I said, one of my goals in doing these workshops was, my principal goal is to have people around the country who are interested in undertaking sustainable agriculture initiatives. My goal is to have them understand what program resources are available to them. So measurable objectives get into sort of a slightly more broken down version of that. And so I might say, I want to make sure that in this case, I'm particularly targeting people in the upper Midwest and even more specifically, Wisconsin. And I want to have X number of workshops in this state. I might say I'd like to have X number of farmers who are newly engaged in trying to use federal programs to support their work, whatever it might be. There are a lot of kind of broken down how many's and what's that come into being measurable objectives. Another question you might want to ask when you're starting a thing, whether it's a new program or it's an initiative on your farm or a community undertaking, you want to say, has anybody else done this thing before? Am I the first person who's ever really had this great insight? Probably not. Who else has done it? And then what could I learn from them? How could I take their insights and save myself time and money? And so that's another very important question to explore. That might actually help you begin to think too, who else might care about your problem? There might be people in your area who have done something similar. And if not, ask around, who else might care? Do you have neighbors or partners, community groups, others who might care about the thing that you're wanting to undertake? An example of this always caught my attention years ago. A friend and colleague started a high-end apple cidery. This was literally 20 years ago that she was starting to develop this. And as she began talking to other people, she wanted to know who else might benefit from this, have an opinion about it. And so she went around and talked with, for example, some of the local orchards. Were they interested in using some of their apples? She talked with some of the local restaurants and found people who might be interested in selling a high-end hard apple cider and some of the tourist opportunities. So she began to understand who was there that had an investment in what she wanted to do. So it really pays to ask that question as you're starting to pull a project together. The next question is one that I try to ask myself pretty much anytime I'm taking on a big thing in my life. And that is, what's my main strategy to approach it? And I force myself to say, not just the first great idea, not just the first idea that I've had, but what are the several ideas for how I could approach the thing I'm trying to do, and give myself some options and then choose what's my main strategy. So for example, if given that my goal is to have folks become more familiar with and use federal programs, I could do a video. I could do workshops, which is what this is. I could send around like little flyers. Part of the reason years ago I chose workshops is in doing workshops, I always found I would hear from folks on the ground what their interests are. And because I am actually, the majority of my life is engaged in policy, it means I got information from people about what are the issues on the ground. So that helped me. That's not your issue. But the point is, there are always reasons why one strategy works better than another. And it pays to have considered all of the strategies before you choose the one that you want to pursue. Okay, I'm trying to move it. There we go. So as you're taking on whatever you're taking on, what is a realistic project timeline? I am that person, I confess, who is apt to say, oh, I can probably get this done in, 2 weeks. And it really is a very squeezed 2 weeks with too many late nights. It would be wiser for me to say, 3 weeks. I am that person who squeezes deadlines till they cry out loud. And so I know that about myself, and I always think I'm doing a better job, and still I squeeze deadlines. But it really pays to figure out on a project, over the narrative arc of a project, what are you wanting to get done? When are you wanting to do it? When do you realistically think you can do it? And I'll give you an example of a time, there are many, many examples, but an example of a time that paid off wasn't even a job project. We were working at our little elementary school, gosh, this is 20 something years ago now, to get a outdoor classroom. And we had gotten city money to help support it, and community dollars we'd passed the hat, and we were ready to go, and we had everything set up. And then boom, what did we discover? This lovely old historic school had lead paint in the windows, and they were going to renovate the building and remove all that lead paint and put in new windows right above our garden to be. So having figured everything out, it gave us a sense of, oh, okay, now we know what we have to change. And we called the city and said, we're going to be late on this one. We'll move ahead on that one. It gave us some variables to play around with so that we could, of course, support that new change in plans, but nonetheless keep moving forward. Having an intentional, realistic timeline gives you a lot more flexibility. A good project, a question is, what resources does your project require? What kind of people, what kind of personnel? I always say basically resources comes down to people, money, and stuff. So who ought to be involved and who do you need to have, not necessarily people, not names, but what kind of people, what kind of expertise, what kind of strengths do you need, what kind of dollars, and what kind of materials. And then the critical question is, of that, what do you already have available to you between you and other people who think this project's important, your collaborators? So that, for those of you who have written grant proposals before, of course, translates into match. I will come to that later on, and particularly we'll do so tomorrow. But every project, you want to know, what do I have already that will help get me there toward that goal? But first, what do I actually need? Do I need a building? Do I need a staff of a half a time person? Do I need 2 people, etc.? And then get very specific about what you've got that will help you tremendously as you start thinking through project design for grant writing. So that for you to know ahead of time what you need, and of the things that you need overall, what do you have, will help get you going. And also, if you don't have something, but you don't have to write a grant for it, you might ask, is there somebody around here who could help? And it will mean you've got skin in the game and your community is investing in you. That's a smart question to try to get attention on to early. Any good project as you kind of live your life and you form your opinions about projects, you form them on the basis of what that project lets you know about itself. So when you're doing a project, you ought to be asking, who else needs to know about the thing I'm doing? Is it people locally? Is it I want my community to know about it mostly? Or is it I'm doing this thing that's kind of unique around the country? It would be great if other people, engaged with me and gave me input, but also learned from what I'm doing. And I could shine a little light on some of this kind of thing that I'm doing. Who else needs to know about your project? And then what's the best way to reach that audience? So if it's a local group, you might do, the Shopper Stopper or the local newspaper or a local radio station, or if it's a national group, I bet you would say, as people almost always do at this point in the workshop when we're face to face, the internet. Get the word out on social media. And then the last question for a well thought through project that you want to have stand the test of time is, how will you measure and evaluate your project's outcomes? And I just want to say, this is usually the part of the thinking that gives people a shiver up and down their spine. Like, ugh, I don't really want to. Suppose there's a bump in the road and I don't actually get things done on my timeline. Oh no. Or suppose I end up changing my approach and it's not the way I thought it was going to be. Oh no. Or suppose one of the things I tried didn't work. Oh no. So the important thing is to, first of all, understand that this is not a trip to the woodshed for a little correctional discipline. It is intended, a good evaluation really helps you think strategically about what you're doing. That's the first thing. Second thing is, it really doesn't pay to only say the good things as you're doing an evaluation, whether it's for a potential grantor or for others. It's actually pretty important to be honest with yourself about what does work and doesn't work. And I really encourage this. We went, as a movement, we went through a long period where we had a lot of people doing, for example, grass-based work, and not actually, and projects around the country engaging in grass-based marketing, but not sharing some of the challenges they faced. And I used to think, goodness, wouldn't it be productive if we all shared some of the challenges we had so that we could get past them? And eventually people did share, and we are getting past them. But it pays to be honest and straightforward. There's that. Last thing to say is how you measure your progress depends on a few things. One thing is, are you trying to measure against your objectives, those measurable objectives I mentioned? Like, I said I was going to do 4 workshops, but I did 5. Woo! Or I said I was going to do only the Midwest, but I actually had people interested from outside the Midwest. Or I thought I was going to do this target audience and I didn't pan out, or whatever, those numbers and specifics. Or are you, if you're really trying to get at the goal, the real point of this exercise isn't numbers and such, it's actually trying to make sure that more, in my case, my example of my goal is having more people use federal programs to advance the work of sustainable agriculture and its many manifestations and communities and market initiatives and so forth all around the country, plus farm projects. And so if you think about the goals, one thing to keep in mind is it's going to be hard at the outset of a project to say, after maybe just if you're getting a grant, for example, a grant might be what, 1 year, 2 years, maybe 3 years. It may be pretty hard to say at the end of that period, oh, I have accomplished everything I wanted to. That's probably unrealistic, right? So you want to figure out a way to assess your trajectory. How can I assess how close I'm getting to where I hoped I would be? And there are ways to do this that are costly, ways that are not. there are effective, you can actually, in my case, for example, at the end of this, Diane's going to do a little poll to find out, how useful this workshop was to you. And then second, she's going to be saying, how likely is it that you are going to try using a federal program to support your work? And that is one of my evaluation techniques. I'm going to say, it looks like from this workshop, X% of the participants said, yeah, they're going to probably use this to try to get more funding to advance a project. That's an example. I could ask for phone numbers and emails and contact everybody later on and say, hey, did you do this next year? I could say, oh, did you actually do it? That would be a very legitimate strategy and more certain than my people's speculation. It also takes more time. And so you have to just evaluate your evaluation strategies. So that's where I'd like to pause. And I think I'd like to pull myself off of the stopping share. And so we can actually see each other and I can see the chat briefly here. We have just about 5 minutes to jump in and hear questions that people have if you have them, or experiences that you have if you have them. So have there been, Diane, any questions in the chat that you want to make sure people air?
The only question so far was whether the recordings are going to be posted, and I answered that in the chat. But so people, if you have a question, please type it in. If you would prefer to unmute yourself, you see a little, if you're on a computer, you see a little microphone icon in the bottom left of your screen, and you can tap that microphone. Sorry, I tapped it and muted myself. Tap that microphone and that will mute or unmute you.
Okay, great. I'm just going to give it a minute. And then if we have no questions, then that's totally fine too. And we can move on ahead. I think that most of this section is pretty straightforward. This is usually the part where I think people think to themselves, yeah, I know that. And that's great. Okay. Oh, somebody have a new group interested in pawpaws. Well, that's really fun to know. I personally happen to be passionate about pawpaws and wish I had more access. So I'm interested in that. But any advice on finding your team? For example, for my project, I need someone who can evaluate the health of silvopasture systems. Diane, how remarkable that you are on this, because you are perfectly suited to that specific question about silvopasture and finding teams. Would you like to pursue that one?
Well, I can answer that question directly, which is if you're not in touch with the Savannah Institute, that would be my first advice. You can also contact me using my email, because as Margaret hinted, I work on silvopasture. But probably more generally, they'd like you to talk, Margaret, about how do you find people? And I will just say, remember extension, and let you take it from there.
Okay, good. I actually think that's a good place to start. So I think it's helpful to ask yourself, who in your network is already networked? And extension's a really good example. Another really nice example is your county conservationist. Every county office has a conservationist, and they're often really helpful in telling you, oh, this is a group that's working. Did you know the such and such group? I mean, if you were to call Diane, she would say, in answer to your specific question, would you, have looked at the Savannah Institute? But so I see somebody asking about aquaponics. And so I think that one of the things we want to do is try to understand where there are people in the state. And the first thing to do probably is to check out, are there nonprofits working in that area or well-known businesses? And so I would personally start with a Google search. If I didn't know people already, I would start with a Google search. I would call extension. I would call other people, and people do this with me. Actually, I'm having a conversation tomorrow with somebody who wants to have, check out some of my connections in the area they're interested in. And that's what people do. So a lot of what we would do to find people is networking. But if it's a local project and what you're wanting to do is find your team locally, that's a different strategy. If you're trying to do it sort of thematically across the state or perhaps region or perhaps more broadly across the country, then you'll really be thinking organizations. If you're really looking for a project right in your community, that may not be your principal strategy. It may be local networking that's going to build your team. So, and Andrew, I see you have a comment. He says, when thinking about your team, remind people to think about evaluation and or outreach, and who is going to help do that in addition to the implementation side of the project. Really good point. Who's going to actually help you figure out? Sometimes it may be you yourself, you'll do it. But if it's a big project, you might be wanting to have an objective outside person who just sort of monitors how the project's going and takes care of that evaluation piece for you. Good points. I think it's a good time, unless there's any other big question here, and I see none. I'm going to go back to my screen sharing, hoping that I can jump back in here. And I can. So this is the second piece of there we go. This is the second portion of today's workshop. Tomorrow's being again about grant writing. So this is about identifying possible funding. Where do you go to find funding? How do you go about doing it? What are the questions you ask? How do you answer those questions and such? So I'm going to start. And I'm going to start with a guide, which is one that we at the Michael Fields Agricultural Institute began putting together way back in the mid-90s. In fact, as I said, this was the guide which prompted me to ask my community what should be in a workshop. We started doing this after the, I want to say the 96 Farm Bill. Is that right? I can't quite make up my mind at this point, but it was the 95. I can't remember. I can't tell you which Farm Bill it was, but in any event, we typically put together a guide. We wait several months after a Farm Bill has passed and then put together a guide about what the programs were that came out of that Farm Bill. So for those of you who aren't quite sure what a Farm Bill is, that's the big piece of legislation that happens every 5-6 years or so at the federal level that kind of lays out the rules of the road for federal policy, and included in that lays out the funding mechanisms and administrative perquisites of different programs. And so we kind of wait for the dust to settle, because after a program gets through the Farm Bill, there is a process that has to go through for getting the implementation. Keep in mind, the Farm Bill is passed by Congress, and then it's the USDA, in our case, that implements that program. And so it takes a little while for the dust to settle. We wait for the dust to settle so we can see kind of what does that program really look like on the ground. And then we put together one of these guides. It is a hard copy. If you can actually see my face, you can see I'm having a copy right here in my hand. And you can get a copy, download it if you would like to, because we do have it on a website, and I have put that website here so you can easily get to it. It's the website of the National Center for Appropriate Technologies, ATTRA project, ATTRA, Appropriate Technology Transfer for Rural Areas. You don't really need to know the full name, ATTRA, but you could use that. You can link that and just download it yourself if that's helpful to you. Another thing that you can do is call the number that I've listed there, which is a 1-800 number, and ask to have a copy mailed to you, and they will do so free of charge. We have arranged for funding to cover that mailing cost. If you haven't, I will say, used ATTRA before, pause when you do that, contact them, and just get to know some of the amazing resources that they have available, tremendously great information that they have accessible. But I digress. So on I go to the next slide of some of the resources that are available to you. Oops, I think I skipped one. I didn't mean to. So here's another set of resources that are available. Historically, when I used to do this workshop, back, say 20 years ago, and I would be going around rural communities especially and ask people, so where would you go to get information? Where do you think you might go? And people would say, libraries. They would sometimes say extension agents. And they these days would say the internet. I'm going to add in the resource that you see on the screen here, which is networking. The truth of my truth is that probably the single biggest way I find out about programs is I'm talking to people. I'm at a conference and I see somebody and I say, oh, I really love to hear about that project. And where'd you get funding for it? Oh, and they tell me about the program. I go, oh, that's interesting. Good to know. Or I read their flyer or newsletter, electronic newsletter online about what they're doing. And it says something like, as you will see in the beginning of this guide here, we say, you know, we gratefully acknowledge the support from, and we list our funders. And, you know, a lot of projects will note at the outset who it is that's funding them. That's another way to get a sense of where there might be some support. Let's see. That's enough for networking, but don't underestimate it. That's one of the best sources. I am going to speak to the internet for a minute here. There are several places to get resources on the internet, and one of them is the first one I put here, and that is put out by the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. It is another guide like the one that I just have just shared with you, the Building Sustainable Farms, Ranches, and Communities Guide, which we will go over in a few. But the Grassroots Guide to Federal Farm and Food Programs is a guide that they put out, again, after every farm bill. And the good news for theirs is it is not intended to be a hard copy. Sometimes they print it, sometimes they don't, but it's online and thus updatable. And so they have information that by being online is both able to go into more depth and also be updated. It's a great resource for federal programs. Sometimes, for example, when people have said to me, oh, I love that the value-added producer grant program has an actual template you can use to follow it. Well, that was created by the National Sustainable Ag Coalition to help people use that program. And there are other resources kind of like that. It's a great resource. Other within USDA, different programs sometimes have got a list, and I've given you a couple here. NRCS has program resources that they provide, and the Ag Marketing Service has programs that they provide. I'm going to show you one more. And the first thing I'm going to say is I'm going to tell you that the website that you will see on the top of your screen, the www.grants.gov, is the website you're going to love to hate. It is a nuisancey website in some ways, and it's also a real resource. One of the things you can do on grants.gov, and I'm going to tell you that you'll hear more about grants.gov tomorrow. The reason is, as you write proposals for federal funding, you will discover that you will need to have information that you can provide to grants.gov, and they have the means of helping you get it. Like, you're going to need to get a DUNS number. You're going to need to have a SAM number. You're going to have a few of these little technical things to do. And that's one of the reasons that tomorrow they'll say, you got to do this on the early side because it can take a little while. That's the more nuisancey side of grants.gov. But you can go to it also to get kind of ongoing notifications about federal programs. And I'm just giving you instructions here because you'll have a copy of this recording and the website. I'm not going to go through this with you now, but here's just to give you some ideas about how you can go through. This was valid as of a few months ago. I think it hasn't changed. They had changed it from their previous systems, but I think this is updated and will help get you. Basically, you can tell them, hey, I'd like to know information about XYZ kinds of programs, and then they will send you information when those programs have a call for proposals or a request for proposals or a notice of funding solicitation, those kinds of solicitation of applications, all that, they will let you know. So now thinking about the questions, how you contemplate which program is going to be useful to you. You, through all of those resources that I just mentioned, which I usually think of as casting out the net, you know, you've got a lot more input than you're going to want to actually deal with. You're not going to go to apply to every program and still have a life. You've really got to accept that you're going to only want to apply to the ones most suited to your project or your initiative or your business desires here. And so you might want to start by thinking through kind of conceptually what you're trying to do. So think creatively and broadly about what your project's needs are. Could more than one kind of help be useful to you? So for example, years ago, when I did this workshop out in Montana, I can remember a gentleman came up and said, oh, you know, that guide you put together, that was so helpful to me. And you know, what I did is I wanted to start a composting business, and I decided there wasn't any exact business. There's nobody that really specifically wanted to fund me to do composting, but I worked with my Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS. And as it happened, the best way for me to handle my manure was to get funded by them using to do compost work. And because I'm near a river and they were concerned about water quality, and because of that, I was able to get funding for my composting business. That is what I'm an example of thinking broadly. If you're, one time we did this workshop and there was a woman who said, I really love earthworms. I care about earthworms, and I want to build earthworm capacity, and I want to grow, produce earthworms and sell earthworms. And you know, we had a little think tank around the group, and we said, what were some of the ways to do that? And people said, well, earthworms are good for fishing bait too, right? If you're wanting to build it. And she didn't like to hear it, but she heard that. There's an opportunity to think of this as a business and to look toward grants and programs that might support a business development. And you could, in these days, perhaps argue it in terms of soil health. But the point is, think broadly about what kind of assistance could be helpful to you. Then this is the next one, is really important. As you're wanting to target the programs that are really helpful to you, you want to ask yourself a few critical questions. The first one is the one that would bring tears to the eyes of my friend with the risk management agency when they used to have me do these workshops for them. He would say, that's the one you have to say over and over again. Keep in mind, you want to ask, of course, could this program help me, help what I want to do? But you have to ask first, could the project I want to take on, the business that I want to start, the initiative that I'm taking on, would it help advance a program's stated mission and goals? He said, that's the basis on which we evaluate these things. So people ought to automatically start asking themselves from the outset, whether really it's a compelling case that what they want to do is going to advance what we have stated that we're trying to do. You don't want to try to pound a square peg into a round hole. You want to ask, is the program's form of assistance appropriate to your needs? For an example, is technical assistance really what you need, or is it funding that you need? Some programs offer technical assistance, but they don't actually offer direct funding. Some programs offer funding, but it's actually what you need is some technical assistance or some planning. So you want to find out, sometimes the support that a program is offering will bifurcate. It can go into two directions. You could have a funding pool for doing some planning, and maybe that includes a market feasibility study or a business plan. And then there's some for implementation of a good business plan. Make sure you figured out where you are and what you actually need. Another question is around, there are 2 or 3 questions around funding. One of them has to do with how likely you are to get funding. And that, one question is, how big is its funding pool? If it's a relatively modest pool, what's the average what's the likelihood of your getting funded? What's the average amount and duration of the grants that you're going to get? And then, how likely is it that I would be getting it? You might need to get into that. We'll talk in a sec. How do you find the answers to these questions? But some of that, maybe you actually have to get some direct conversation with the program manager. And if you don't find this in the call for proposals. A very important one for many people is the funding available up front, or is it the more typical case that it's on a reimbursement basis? There are some wonderful programs that don't restrict you, but most federal programs pay you after you've already expended the dollars that you need for what you're doing. And thus you have to be able to cash flow it and then get reimbursed. Are you able to do that? Critical question. Another really important question is, what are eligibility requirements? For example, the Value-Added Producer Grant Program you're going to hear tomorrow, that is a wonderful program. It's available for farmers and groups of farmers and cooperatives of farmers, but it's not available for nonprofits or counties or whatever, or community groups. On the other hand, there are programs that are really like the Beginning Farmer Rancher Development Grant Program. That's a program aimed at not directly helping a beginning farmer by giving them funding, but helping them by having community groups or nonprofits or whoever provide some of that technical assistance and support. So and training and all that. So who can get funded? And then also, what can that funding be used for? Again, using the Value-Added Producer Grant Program, that you can't use that if you need a building or you need infrastructure. It won't pay for that. It's going to pay for some of those other really hard to fund things like the staffing. It's going to, the implementation of a program, the getting it on the ground and making it happen, the labor, some of the materials. Another question is, what are the financial matching requirements? I mentioned earlier, many programs want to just have you show skin in the game. And in the case of federal grants, they usually want it to be, almost always want it to be non-federal match. They want to say, what are you bringing to this that's not from another federal program? And that can often take two forms, and this will get spoken to tomorrow, but I'll briefly say there are roughly two kinds of match. And one of them is cash, nice cold cash. And the other one is other stuff that could be monetized for the monetary value. So you could say, we have so many volunteers doing such and such a thing, and that's worth X amount of money. When we were doing our that little project I mentioned for our community outdoor classroom, what were some of the matching things? We got some folks at the university to develop a landscape plan for us free of charge, and we used that as match. And we had a landscaper who was willing to do some of the heavy lifting, bringing in gravel and so forth, in exchange for having their name out there and a sign out there for quite a while saying, we did it. So we had things that we could say, we did all this, and plus all the volunteer hours. So we had a combination of cash and financial, and in-kind match. What kind of restrictions? Sometimes programs want you to do one-to-one. Sometimes they only want 50%. Like if you ask for 50,000, they would say you need to show 25. You just have to find out if every program is different. You want to learn. You want to find out if a program's application deadlines and funding timeframes are suited. For example, some programs are going to go through a process that involves pre-proposals. So you might put in a proposal in December of this year, and it goes through a process of discernment, and they say, oh, X percentage of those pre-proposals are going to be given the green light for going ahead and getting further, and putting in a full proposal. That takes a few extra months. So it could be that you might not hear until August. And then there are other programs that are quicker. There are also questions about how long it is going to take for the funding. I've just got an email this morning from a colleague who got a big project through the NRCS this year for a multi-year big initiative, multi-partner initiative. And she's still working out with them the contract and getting the details. And though that it was approved in the summer, it isn't actually going to really start until January. You want to know those things. So trying to get clarity on that. The last thing's what I call the hassle factor. And that is, do people who've used this program think that the program's reporting requirements and other administrative expectations are reasonable and that the program's well administered? Or is it kind of like, ugh? You want to find that out. And of course, the question is, how do you answer all those different questions? So the first and best place to get most of the information that you need is read the request for proposals or the notice of solicitation of applications or the request for applications. Every program calls it something, and sometimes it's called a different thing from another program. It's all the same thing. It's usually very tiny little print, sometimes very, very legalistic and annoying to read. You have to read it a few times, but you will find them on the internet, and you can find those linkages from www.grants.gov that I've mentioned. But you will easily find information about those programs. If you were to go through our guide and find programs that strike you as maybe of interest, or go through the grassroots guide that I mentioned from the National Sustainable Ag Coalition, you will find the name of a program, and then you can just go do a Google search and you will see information there about when their next call for proposals is likely to be. And that will help give you some information about how do you get information about it. So you will get information about how to find information. Most programs these days, not all, this is true for both state and federal, but a great number of programs now offer webinars for potential applicants, so that you have, if you've got questions about things about what you want to say and what you don't want to, or like, what do you mean by this? And are we allowed to do that? You'll have those questions answered either by the presenter or by the Q&A following. Those webinars almost always are recorded, and you can find them on their website. So you can go back, and you really should do that before you do the third thing, which is to call the program staff. But if you do have questions which are not spoken to there, and you're really not sure if this makes sense for you, call the program staff. This is really important. Never have I seen a program staff sorry that people called them up. That's what they want to do. That makes them sad when people apply and really get off the mark because they didn't call up. So please do understand, you should call the program staff. Their contact information is listed on the website and on the request for proposals. And then for that hassle factor question, for example, you're going to have to ask past grantees. They're not going to tell you the detail. You're not going to find the program staff saying, well, really, we're a nuisancey program. Nobody. But you're going to get that clarity. And frankly, most programs aren't nuisancey. There's always nuisance with anything bureaucratic, always gotta be. It's not because people are difficult, but they have to be able, they're accountable to the government. They have to demonstrate that people who are coming are doing, have got clear, good projects, and they want to make sure that they have their T's crossed and I's dotted. But most of them are really good faith programs with really wonderful staff, and they're mostly really straightforward, and you can work with them. But if there's any, if you need to get some clarity, ask past grantees. They can give you the scoop on how they felt about things. And then I just want to give you a few more resources that could help you as you go through this. One of them is, we have some of the documents that Diane will have sent that we have, like the grant writing do's and don'ts, how to design projects, what we've already gone through here. This first one is the handout that I usually give to people in a workshop, and they have a print copy and then they can write in the margins. But also grant writing do's and don'ts, strategies for writing budgets for federal grants, how to do electronic submission. This PowerPoint will have all of those sorts of things there. Also, we offer free advising on grants and other financial aid in the Midwest. And we are particularly interested in underserved farmers and other stakeholders groups assisting them. But anybody, anywhere can get, well, one thing, we are glad to help you. Even if you're not an underserved farmer, we're glad to help you. And you can contact that our grants or financial aid advisor, whose name is Martin Bailke, at that contact information. But also, we do have an email notice list that we send out to folks, just letting you know when we get information about a call for proposal. Martin sends that out to folks who've asked for it. So you can send him a note and say, could you put me on that list to get information? And that's where I would like to stop and once again hop off and be able to answer questions and see if we've had anything that people have asked about. and I see that Trisha Wagner, thank you, with Extension, has offered some great resources for program development and evaluation. I appreciate that. And
so someone's asking, are small farms at a disadvantage based on what the farm can contribute to USDA in return for government funding?
what a super good question. This will depend upon what program you're targeting. There are historically some, for example, conservation programs where the people who make the decisions about who gets funded for some of those programs, they're wanting to answer the question, what are the biggest problems that we can solve? And if you have a very big farm with a very big problem, they're going to probably score better. These are local decisions that get made by local groups working with, for example, the NRCS, and they will evaluate on the basis of the problems that can get alleviated. And so sometimes it has been the case that smaller farmers are at a disadvantage in that particular context. But just to point out, there are other programs, and for one thing, that isn't always true, and NRCS has really worked to try to address it. And there are other programs like the Conservation Stewardship Program, which work very hard to be more size neutral. And so there's that. Then also just to say, there are, for example, within the credit system, there are set-asides intended for beginning farmers, and that often is smaller farmers. And so you will find in several programs that there are set-asides intentionally designed to help smaller farmers. And that I would say for the SARE program as an example, I know you'll speak to this tomorrow, Diane, but I would say that the SARE program, it is much more size neutral. It's not aimed at that. It's much more at what are you going to learn from the Farmer Rancher Grant Program? What are you going to learn and therefore be able to share with other people? And you could learn a lot in a very small area that could be applicable to others. And I don't think that they would say acreage matters at all to that, that question. Great question. And I'm just going to ask a question of others too, to ask you in the last couple of minutes, those of you who have gone through this process of finding resources and of making choices, what has been most helpful for you? Please put it in the chat. If there are things that I didn't cover, when we're doing this in person, it's really lovely to have folks who have done this in the past share their experiences. It's a little clumsier virtually, but I will say by doing it virtually, we've made it more accessible to more folks. So we, chime in if you've got other things that you want to add.
Well, Margaret, I would like to ask you to comment a little bit on working with a team. One of the things that I'm not sure you have maybe emphasized as much as you sometimes do is that, you did talk about putting together your team right in the beginning, but that process of working with a team and pulling together a big grant proposal.
It's true. And so one of the things that I think it's helpful, and tomorrow I think you're going to be using that slide that I sent you, like where we actually we put out a little, I put together a score sheet sort of, and I say all the things that have to be done to get this grant proposal done. We decide who's going to do X, Y, Z, and we walk through all the things that have to be done for the grant proposal, and you'll cover that. But the choosing the team at the front end is actually an art form. And keep in mind, if you're putting together a project, it is you who are in charge of it. You're the one who gets to make the choices. What do you care most about? And one of the things I say is I want people who are pleasant to work with, hardworking, and do the things that they say they're going to do. So there are always those people who are apt to be a little bit difficult and to tell you, this is what I think you should do, but they don't really offer to help. That's not who I want on my team. And then there's also the question of, is it possible to have too much of a good thing? I don't like my teams to be enormous. I like to have relatively modest teams. So I go for sort of in the 4 to 6 range if I were to pick. And I want people who, as I say, are experienced, who bring fire in their belly for the thing we're doing and can help make it happen. I just don't burden yourself with misery. You're in charge when you're putting together the team for your project. don't make your life harder. That's my bottom line point here. And we're now actually just past time, so I think we need to call it there.
Although we told people if they do have questions, that they can stay on. We would be willing to stay on longer. I'm going to end the poll because it looks like people have stopped answering it. Thank you very much for filling out these polls. This is, as Margaret mentioned, being able to, all of us who are putting this on are ourselves funded by grants. And we are required to share this information with our grantors.
Absolutely. Last thing, just to say, a question was, we're not just talking federal programs. No, we're not. And tomorrow you will have a wealth of really great state programs. Wisconsin has more than we used to have. And you'll have presenters able to talk about those tomorrow.
Well, Margaret, thank you for doing a fantastic job getting through a huge amount of information quickly. And I will stay on, but if people need to get on to other things, they can go ahead.
And I just